So joining us now, Brit Hume, Fox News senior political analyst. Brit, this is a president who is always full of surprises. He could have just slipped off to Davos this evening, but he took that moment and you could tell that he wanted to say this to those reporters, that bring it on was the message. What do you think?
Well, it's not the first time that he has said there's no collusion or anything else wrong, including, of course, obstruction of justice. And the fact that he has said this over and over again can lead you in two directions. One is that this is a guy who's protesting too much because the Mueller team is going to find something and he's denying it ahead of time. And the other way of looking at it is he's awfully confident about this and awfully certain and awfully strong and has been from the start. And the fact that he is now apparently on the verge of going to talk to Mr. Mueller or have Mr. Mueller come and talk to him, and he seems eager to do it, suggests that he feels, at least, that he has nothing to hide. The idea that he's going to be under oath is something that I'm sure his lawyers are very worried about. Not because the president would go in with any intention of lying or covering up, but because any number of these special counsel or independent counsel investigations have resulted in charges that have nothing to do with the matter for which the counsel was appointed to investigate. That these are crimes or problems or charges that occurred growing out of things that happened during the course of the investigation. So here you have the president with a lot at stake going into a situation under oath where, if he slips up, misstates, and of course this president is not phenomenally articulate, he could get himself into trouble. So it'll be interesting to see if indeed he does do this conversation with Director Mueller, with Special Counsel Mueller, under oath.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember him saying once not long ago, well, if I could get the same deal that Hillary Clinton got, a holiday discussion, not under oath, not with the lead investigator, because James Comey wasn't in the room when Hillary Clinton was spoken to, and others who were in the room get immunity, even though they're part of the investigation. He thought that would be a pretty good situation. It would give him equal treatment. If he does go in there under oath, as you say, he opens himself up to an inconsistency that perhaps has been laid down by some of the prior people who were interviewed. But it does look like the focus, just based on who they've been talking to, Brit, appears to be on obstruction of justice and go back to the firing of James Comey and Michael Flynn. So, if that's the case, and a lot of lawyers that we've spoken to on this program, and I know you have too, say that, that he has every right to fire James Comey, that obstruction of justice is a pretty tough bar to meet here. So perhaps the president feels, that legally he's on decent ground here.
Well, he certainly has a right to fire the FBI director at any time for any reason. However, if it can be shown that he acted with corrupt motives, that would be the kind of thing you would refer to the House of Representatives for potential impeachment. I doubt that Bob Mueller is interested in trying to bring some kind of an indictment against the president. That would be without precedent and extraordinary. So the question arises is whether the president, in firing Mueller, did so for good reason. And everything we've learned about, I say Mueller, I meant Comey.
Yes, Comey.
Everything we've learned about Comey's conduct during the Hillary Clinton investigation and going forward suggests that there was ample reason to act against this guy. We don't know, Martha, what Mueller has. But there's plenty of reason to think that this may not end up in charges.
Yeah, we should also mention that there's another part of this audio where the president says something to the effect of, subject to agreement by my attorneys. That's a pretty big hole that you could drive a truck through. He could walk this entire thing back and say, it was my desire to speak to Robert Mueller and I have nothing to hide. My attorneys feel like it isn't something that I should do. Do you think that...
Look, I'm not a lawyer. I've covered a lot of these cases. I wouldn't let him testify under oath if it were up to me. Not with the history of what happens to these independent counsels or special counsels. I just think it's ill-advised and probably not necessary. I think the president likes to talk about it because I think he thinks he's innocent and he's not afraid of telling his story under oath. But I still think it's, from a lawyer's point of view, representing him and trying to protect his interests, I'm not sure a good lawyer will want him to do that. That doesn't mean that the president won't override him.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. It might not necessarily matter if he decides that he really wants to tell his story and that he feels he's got nothing to hide, and he goes in there and talks to Bob Mueller. But it's going to be a fascinating few weeks when he gets back from his trip. Brit, thank you so much.